India-United States relations through the Cold War. Estrangement, realignment, and strategic consequences. Introduction. A relationship defined by structure, not sentiment. The relationship between India and the United States during the Cold War cannot be understood through the lens of diplomatic goodwill or shared democratic values alone. It was a structurally constrained interaction shaped by systematic pressures, ideological rigidity, and asymmetries of power. The Cold War imposed a binary logic upon global politics, dividing the world into competing spheres of influence led by the United States and the Soviet Union. Within this rigid architecture, states were expected to align, comply, or be marginalized. India's attempt to resist this structural compulsion through a policy of non-alignment placed it in a contradictory position. It sought autonomy within a system that punished ambiguity. The resulting India-US relationship was therefore not merely strained but fundamentally misaligned at the level of incentives, expectations, and strategic objectives. The immediate post-independence context, divergence at the foundational stage. The India emerged as an independent state in 1947 at a moment when the Cold War was crystallizing into a global bipolar order. The United States was driven by its containment doctrine sought to incorporate newly independent states into its strategic architecture to counter the expansion of the Soviet influence. India, however, refused to enter into formal alliances and instead adopted the doctrine of non-alignment, emphasizing sovereignty, non-interference, and peaceful coexistence. This decision, while framed as a principled stance, functioned as a defensive strategy rooted in material limitations. India lacked the military and economic capacity to engage in great power competition, therefore attempting to preserve strategic autonomy by avoiding entanglement. From the American perspective, this posture was interpreted not as neutrality but as unreliability. The United States viewed the global struggle as existence and binary, and any refusal to align was perceived as indirectly benefiting the opposite bloc. Thus, from the outset, a structural contradiction emerged. India sought autonomy while the United States demanded alignment. This divergence established the foundation for decades of mistrust and strategic distance. Non-alignment as strategy, autonomy or strategic evasion. India's leadership, particularly under Jawaharlal Nehru, articulated non-alignment as a moral and political doctrine aimed at transcending bloc politics. It emphasized independence of judgment and resistance to external domination. However, beneath this ideological framing lay a more pragmatic calculus. Non-alignment allowed India to extract economic and technical assistance from both superpowers without committing to either, thereby maximizing short-term gains while minimizing immediate risks. Despite its apparent advantages, non-alignment imposed a significant long-term cost. By refusing to integrate into either bloc, India limited its access to deep security guarantees and institutional support. It remained outside the formal alliance network that structured global power distribution, thereby reducing its leverage in international negotiations. The United States, in particular, interpreted India's stance as obstructive, especially when India criticized the Western interventionism and supported positions perceived as favorable to socialist or anti-colonial movements. The policy of non-alignment thus functioned as a form of strategic hedging but also generated systematic distrust. It neither secured full autonomy nor established reliable partnership, leaving India in a position of partial isolation. The American strategy of containment, instrumental alliances over ideological affinity. The United States approached South Asia through the lens of containment, prioritizing strategic utility over ideological compatibility. While India was the larger democracy, it was Pakistan that aligned more readily with American objectives. Pakistan joined US-led arrangements such as SEATO and CENTO, thereby integrating itself into the American strategic framework. This alignment provided Pakistan with military aid, economic assistance, diplomatic backing, transforming it into a key regional partner. India, by contrast, was perceived as resistant and unpredictable. Its refusal to join alliances, combined with its engagement with China and criticism of Western policies, diminished its value in American calculus. As a result, the United States adopted a dual-track approach, attempting to engage India diplomatically while simultaneously strengthening Pakistan as a counterweight. This dynamic illustrates a core principle of Cold War geopolitical alignment. This dynamic illustrates a core principle of Cold War geopolitics: alignment determined value. States that contributed directly to containment were rewarded, while those that pursued independent paths were marginalized or pressured. India's strategic ambiguity therefore translated into reduced influence within the American policy framework. India-China relations and the strategic miscalculation of trust. One of the most consequential aspects of India's Cold War foreign policy was its approach to China. In the early years, India sought to build a cooperative relationship with the People's Republic of China, emphasizing Asian solidarity and shared post-colonial identity. The Panchshil principle of peaceful coexistence became the cornerstone of this engagement, reflecting India's belief in diplomatic accommodation over confrontation. However, this approach underestimated the strategic ambitions of China and overestimated the stability of ideological alignment. The deterioration Sino-Indian relations culminated in the 1962 border war, which exposed the limitations of India's assumptions. The conflict not only resulted in military defeat but also shattered the illusion of regional solidarity. The aftermath of the war forced India to reassess its strategic posture. It sought and received military economic assistance from the United States, marking a temporary convergence of interests. However, this alignment was reactive rather than structural. India didn't abandon non-alignment; the underlying mistrust between the two countries persisted. The episode demonstrated that India's early strategy had failed to anticipate shifts in regional power dynamics, leaving it vulnerable to external shocks. The Pakistan factor, persistent source of strategic tension. The triangular relationship between India, Pakistan, and the United States was a central determinant of Indo-US relations during the Cold War. Pakistan's alignment with the United States created a persistent asymmetry as American military aid to Pakistan was perceived by India as a direct threat. This perception was reinforced during the conflicts such as the 1965 and the 1971 Indo-Pak wars, where the United States either supported Pakistan or adopted positions unfavorable to India. For India, this dynamic underscored the risks of remaining outside formal alliances. While it sought to maintain autonomy, its primary regional rival was embedded within a powerful external network. This imbalance constrained India's strategic options and contributed to its eventual tilt towards Soviet Union, particularly during periods of heightened tension. The United States, on the other hand, viewed Pakistan as a more reliable partner due to its willingness to align. The relationship was transactional, driven by mutual utility rather than long-term stability. This approach, while effective in advancing short-term objectives, exacerbated regional tensions and deepened Indian distrust on American intentions. The 1971 crisis and the consolidation of the Indo-Soviet alignment. The 1971 Indo-Pak War marked the lowest point in the India-US relations during the Cold War. The United States, under the Nixon administration, supported Pakistan despite evidence of humanitarian crisis in East Pakistan. India interpreted this stance as a strategic threat, prompting it to formalize its relationship with the Soviet Union through the Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation. This development represented a significant shift in India's foreign policy. While it continued to claim non-alignment, its action indicated a clear strategic preference. The Soviet Union provided military, economic, and diplomatic support, enabling India to achieve its objectives in the conflict and secure the independence of Bangladesh. The crisis highlighted the limitations of India's earlier approach. Faced with a coordinated US China Pakistan alignment, India was compelled to seek external support to balance the threat. This marked the transition from nominal neutrality to de facto alignment, demonstrating that systematic pressure ultimately overrode ideological commitments. The 1980s proxy conflict and strategic divergence. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 further complicated the US India relations. The United States, seeking to counter Soviet expansion, supported Pakistan as a frontline state in the conflict. This support included significant military and economic assistance, reinforcing Pakistan's strategic position in the region. India, meanwhile, maintained its relationship with the Soviet Union and expressed concern over the growing American presence in South Asia. The divergence in positions during this period reflected deeper structural differences. The United States, prioritizing containment of the Soviet Union, while India focused on regional stability and preservation of its strategic autonomy. The decade was characterized by limited engagement and persistent mistrust. While there were efforts to improve relations through diplomatic exchanges and cooperative and cooperation in specific areas, these initiatives were constrained by broader geopolitical dynamics. The relationships aimed at the relationships remained transactional and episodic, lacking the depth required for Cold War sustained partnership. The end of the Cold War, structural reset and strategic reorientation. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 fundamentally altered the global balance of power. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, and the bipolar structure that had defined international relations for decades was replaced by a unipolar order. For India, this transition represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The loss of the Soviet Union as a strategic partner forced India to reassess its foreign policy. Economic liberalization and integration into the global economy became priorities, aligning India more closely with the United States. At the same time, the United States began to recognize India's potential as a counterweight to a rising China, leading to a gradual transformation of the relationship from estrangement to engagement. This shift was not driven by ideological convergence but by strategic recalibration. Both countries identified overlapping interests in areas such as regional stability, economic cooperation, and balance of power dynamics. The legacy of Cold War mistrust, however, continued to influence perceptions and limit the pace of rapprochement. Conclusion: structural lessons and strategic consequences. The history of India-US relations during the Cold War reveals a consistent pattern. Structural forces outweigh ideological intentions. India's attempt to maintain autonomy through non-alignment was constrained by the realities of a bipolar system that demanded alignment. The United States, operating within a containment framework, prioritized strategic utility over normative affinity, leading to a preference for more compliant partners. This resulting relationship was characterized by missed opportunities, reactive adjustments, and persistent mistrust. India's reluctant India's reluctance to commit limited its influence, while American reliance on Pakistan exacerbated regional tensions. Ultimately, the end of the Cold War provided an opportunity to reset the relationship, but the underlying lesson remains clear. In a system defined by power, competition, ambiguity is not a sustainable strategy for the long term.